Well, Brian, obviously the big news this week was the change in the Duper algorithm back to a point sort of spread as opposed to simply wins and loss. And it does seem like no matter what change Duper makes to the algorithm, the angry voices seem to outweigh or at least online, the angry voices seem to sort of take over. We had a really interesting sort of conversation about this in Grand Rapids at MLP this past weekend. And so I kind of wanted to just continue that conversation and bring light to what this sort of change means from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's long overdue. I mean, I think it used to be like that, and for the last couple of years, it changed. And I think it changed. Just to give a little background. I mean, I used to be a CEO of MLP, and that was when Duper was part of MLP, so I was pretty involved with it back then. And it makes a lot of sense to account for points. I don't think it should be entirely based on point differential, but if you think about like the goal of pickleball, it is to win points, right? I think if you look at some models like Elo, that's designed for things like chess, where the goal is to win the match. Now you could say in pickleball the goal is to win the match, but that's actually a misperception, right? Because strategically, you think about all the strategies you do. It's not to win the match; it's to win points, right? You are trying. You're strategically designed in every. Oh, sure.
Can we debate that slightly?
Sure.
Right, but there are certain strategies that, and I think that I'm looking at this from a pro game perspective, where things do differ from amateur games. I think in certain skill levels, until you get to a point, I think you should hit your favorite shots to your favorite spots every single time. However, if I do that, my opponents adapt. And so I have to play suboptimally sometimes to set up another pattern that I want to run at a different point, right? I might go down the line a shot where I feel like I'm only going to win that maybe 40% of the time. However, it opens up different patterns that have a higher rate of success, right? So,
Right.
like, how do you? I might be sacrificing 1 point at the expense of another, but I do suppose, back to your point, it would be in pursuit of winning the most points total.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. Is that you're sacrificing perhaps optimal strategy on each and every point to win the majority of points, right? Whereas in something like chess, you can't. The goal is to win the match. It doesn't matter if you're left with all your pieces on the board or one piece left on the board, right? So you might sacrifice pieces for the goal of winning the match. When you say you're not hitting your optimal shot, it's to set up other shots, right? You still know you need to win the most points, right? So in pickleball, think about it. When you think about your strategy, you're trying to maximize points, and the match just happens to be when the game stops. The game stops when it's the first player to 11 or 15 or 21. But your goal is to win most points. Now, and one of the nice things too is that you have all of this data. If you were just looking at who wins, you're throwing away all this incredibly valuable data that, it may not mean that much to people if you're playing thousands and thousands of matches, but for most people, particularly since the average Duper user probably plays something like, 10 matches, you're throwing away all this important data. And there's also a lot of value in the subcomponents, which you haven't seen that much of, but, it would be incredibly valuable, to be able to look at what is your Duper, in gender versus mixed, which I think that they're going to be doing fairly shortly. What is a gender versus mixed? What is it indoor versus outdoor? What is it, for someone like you in team competitions versus individual? Like I would think I would imagine you would have a better Duper in team events than individual. And, I say that because I'm very similar to you. I think I play much better in team events than I do in individual events. I'd love to see what my Duper was one versus the other. It's a different mentality. I think, you play it like a sprint rather than a marathon. When you've got, sure.
Couldn't you do that with wins and why is that? So I agree that that's something that should be done in the future, but how is the new point spread Duper model make that any different? Right?
Because
You could have been
when you have more data,
tracking these things before or no?
When you have more data, your analysis is just more accurate. So think about if me and you play a match, if we just look at who wins and losses, that's just one data point, the win-loss. But if we played 2 out of 3 games and it was 11-9, 7-11, 11-5, you've got 50 points of data that if you're not looking at point differential, you're throwing all that information out. Now, I want to be clear that like it's not the end all be all. I would think if I was designing the algo that you want to factor in lots of variables. And just to give you a background, like I've worked, I'm a sports geek too, so I'm into sports analytics and different sports teams. I helped start a sports analytics program at the University of Florida that the basketball team is pretty actively using. And in my prior career on Wall Street, I ran a quantitative trading business, right? So I'm quite familiar that you've got quantitative models that have potentially 1,000 factors that go into it. And what you're really supposed to do is constantly backtest and regress different models. And you're always trying to solve for some first principle. And that first principle, for the goal of a rating is to have the most accurate rating possible. You want to have a rating that I can predict, when Zane plays Brian tomorrow, what is the most accurate point spread, right? So you want to have that. So if that's your primary goal, and you're not solving for, what I thought a lot of the solve was for before, when you really just factored in winner must go up, right? That was the old rule. Winner must go up. You're solving for, the winning player, the ego involved with the fact that the player won but didn't cover the spread, and I don't want to go down, right? But that's not how sports analytics works in any real power rating type of thing, right? So, for example, the best example I think is like sports betting, right? If you're betting, if the Kansas City Chiefs are playing the New York Jets, right? If you bet on the Kansas City Chiefs and they were a 14-point favorite and Kansas City just wins by a field goal, you lose your money and you don't complain, right? Because they were supposed to win by more. Um, Everyone accepts that. You know that that's true. And by the way, if you looked at the NFL power ratings, win-loss is a factor, but it's a small factor, right? The other factors that go into it, point differential is huge, right? Strength of schedule is huge. There are other metrics like points per possession that go into it. It's actually fairly complicated, but that's what your Duper should be, right? It should be a multi-factor model that goes into it. If you just looked at wins and losses, it's super simplistic. So you lose all that data to answer your question, and you don't want to lose it because it just makes it more accurate, right? And I do want to address what you were saying. Like I think where people, have issues with it is that in the extreme cases, and you can adjust for that. So for example, I do think winning matters. Like you could win a match and actually get outscored in points. And if you were playing an equal player, your Duper may go down. I do think that winning the match is worth something, right? So, finger in the air, I would say like if you win a match, the win itself should be worth 2 or 3 points, right? So if, I beat you 11-9, from a Duper perspective, maybe that point differential should be 13-9 or 14-9 or something like that. And whatever that point percentage is, you're factoring the actual performance versus what the predicted performance. If it's higher, then I go up, you go down. If it was lower, then I go down, you go up. And then it's calibrated off of that. I also think things like blowouts, like it should, like if me and you legitimately played, Duper would probably say you should beat me 11-2, right? And if you beat me 11
Right.
0, 1, 2, 3, 4, I don't think it should matter much, right? Because what we don't want is someone feeling like they've got to pour it on 24/7, right? As long as you beat me comfortably, it shouldn't make any difference whether you beat me 11-0, 11-3, in my opinion.
Yeah. I'm not gonna lie, rather had fun.